A giant thank you to the lovely people at Skylum, the makers of Luminar Neo, for agreeing to sponsor a video that frankly I was going to make anyway. You're awesome, and the money will go towards helping me make a couple of videos that I've wanted to make for a really long time later this year. Hello everybody, hope you're all well. This is a mist filter, very dirty mist filter. Fingerprints all over it. And I can't see actually now, that light is really bright. I should not have looked directly into it. But yeah, mist filters. I've been asked increasingly over the past couple of years if I use these for my photography, and if so, which one I use. Now, if you're not familiar with these, sometimes they're called diffusion filters. They come in all different flavors. This one, for instance, is a mist filter that's also a variable ND filter. I use this one all the time for filming videos. In fact, I've got another one on the lens that I'm filming on right now, just a different size. This one is not an ND filter of any kind, it's just a black mist filter, which basically means if you look closely, it's got lots of little black dots on it. You can also get white mist filters, and frankly the term mist filter spans a huge range of products, but the most common result you get from a mist filter is a softening and a glow around highlights. And it's a look that I really like, hence the fact that I use them all the time for video. But I never use these filters for photography, despite the fact that I love the look. And the reason that I don't use these filters for photography spans back to about 20 years ago, I would say, when I started learning Photoshop. Now, I suspect that I'm not the only absolute baller among us who would spend their evenings and weekends on Photoshop forums back then. You know, when I got fed up of chasing honeys, that's where I was. I didn't chase honeys. And all of you other players will remember from that time that I reckon about half the conversations on those Photoshop forums were about destructive versus non-destructive changes. Good times. And if you're not familiar with that concept, basically, it used to be very easy 20 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever, to get yourself in a bit of a pickle in Photoshop and make changes that further down the line you could no longer change. I feel like that needs an example. Say, for instance, you've got a single layer and you sharpen your photo, and then you proceed to make 100 other changes. Well, depending on the settings of your history panel might not remember 100 changes. It might only remember 20 changes, which means that all the changes you made to your image more than 20 changes ago, you can no longer change unless you use smart objects or other layers or a few other bits and bobs. And yeah, so a lot of the chat on those forums was about how to avoid destructive changes. And I say all that to say that when you put a filter like this in front of your lens, you are essentially making a destructive change because you're altering what your sensor captures. And that's not always a problem, you know. If you always love the results that you get from one of these filters, fantastic. But if there are ever times where you want to dial down the strength of this effect, or you want to get rid of the effect altogether, then it can be very, very difficult if you're using one of these because you're changing what is being captured by the camera. And so enter software, and specifically software and a tool that I use for probably between 50 and 60% of my photos. And that's been the case for the past 18 months or 2 years, I would say. Right, okay, so here we are in Luminar Neo, and we'll just do a really quick edit before I talk about the 3 tools that I want to talk about today. One of them particularly, but it's 3 tools overall. This is a photo from Svalbard that I took last summer. And I don't know, I love photos like this. They're not everyone's cup of tea, but I think there's just enough chaos and serenity to make quite an interesting photo, I think. And the light is beautiful as well. So I'm going to up the exposure just a touch. I say just a touch, best part of a stop. I'll add some contrast, bring up the highlights, and I'll bring down the shadows as well. And I mean, ultimately that is just adding more contrast. So you might say, why don't you just do that all with the contrast slider? But if you do it across 2 sliders, you give yourself more control. The blacks, I'm just going to bring up a touch, something like that. And I'll do the same with the curve panel. That way I get to decide what is classed as black. Temperature, I'm going to make a touch warmer, not quite that warm. Bring the tint down a touch. Bring saturation down a bit. and up the vibrance a bit. Basically, I want to make the saturated colours less saturated and the less saturated colours more vibrant. Hopefully that makes sense. Sharpening, yes, let's have some sharpening. But let's also make sure that we add some masking too. Noise reduction, no. Optics, yeah, let's fix all the problems with the lens. But so far, that looks a pretty good start. Let's get into colour and have some fun. HSL, now I'll basically do what I do for most of my edits, which is really up the saturation of the warm colours, and I'll bring down the saturation of the cool colours, specifically the blue. I'm also going to go into luminance and up the luminance of the blue. I want to make the blue brighter because I love bright highlights, as I'm sure many of you know. And then the hue, I'm going to make the reds more orange, something like that. And I'm going to make the yellows more orange too. Okay, as a starting point, I quite like that. Then I'm going to go to structure, which is kind of like clarity in Lightroom. And I'm just going to take that down to get rid of some of the local contrast. Something like that. Difficult to see, I imagine, on a YouTube video. And for that reason, I'm going to really accentuate some of these changes just so that you can see them. So some of these might look a bit ridiculous. Bear in mind that I would massively dial them back for the final photos. Okay, but here is where the magic happens, and it's called Mystical. It's even got a magical name, but the Mystical tool. And in truth, it's actually not really mystical at all. It's quite obvious when you start playing around with this tool what it does. And as I increase this slider, what you might be able to see is that it's softening and brightening the bright parts of the image, and it's also increasing the saturation and contrast in the dark parts of the image, which is exactly what I want from a tool like this. I want to soften the highlights but maintain and increase contrast in the shadows. Now, as I say, I've gone way too far with that, but hopefully that gives you a demonstration of what it's doing. I find with these tools that the best way to start understanding them is to dial them all the way up to 100 and play around with them from there. It gives you a much better perspective on what's going on. Now this tool comes with 5 sliders, so we've upped the main slider, the amount, to 100, and then we can start playing around with these other sliders to get an understanding of what they do. Shadows is pretty self-explanatory. If I take it all the way down, you make the shadows darker. You bring it all the way up, you make the shadows lighter. I think where it was at about 25 is pretty good. Smoothness, this is an interesting one. If you take a look at this roof on this building closest to us, as I dial up the smoothness and then dial down the smoothness. Basically, if you've got 0 smoothness, the effect just ends at the sharp edges. If you've got lots of smoothness, the effect slowly fades out across a larger area. So smoothness, I'm going to stick at around, I don't know, -60, I think looks pretty good. Bearing in mind that the amount is currently at 100, which is way too much. And then colorize, you can play around with the saturation and the warmth as well. But to get a handle on those, I'm going to dial back the amount because this does look a bit ridiculous. I find that between 30 and 40 is a pretty good place for this tool. And if I hide it and then put it back on, you can see that the effect, unless you're at 100, is pretty subtle, but it does actually make a big difference just to the softness of the look of the image. But it provides it with infinitely more control than a filter. Now there are a couple of other tools which normally I don't find as useful as Mystical, but in some cases they can be as useful, if not more useful. And I should say that with Luminar Neo, there are a couple of ways to use it. The first way is like this. You can just edit the entire image on Luminar Neo. The second way is as a plug-in to something like Lightroom. And that is probably, to be honest, how I use it more. So I'll edit in Lightroom with my presets. I just find it faster. And then I'll open Luminar Neo to play around with the Mystical tool in particular. So let's open this image in Luminar Neo. And let's look at one of the other tools I wanted to talk about, Glow, which is just below Mystical. And there are 4 different kinds of glow which we can have a quick look at. So again, let's take the amount to 100. You get a ridiculous look, but it does make it easier to assess what's going on. So this is soft focus, and as you can see, it makes everything soft, basically. There's nothing really happening as far as I can tell with contrast or saturation. It just makes all the edges really soft, and you can open out advanced settings, and again, you get access to softness, so you can change how soft the effect is. And you can change how bright the effect is, how much contrast there is, and how much warmth there is. Again, pretty powerful tool. It just doesn't meet my eye always in the same way that the mystical tool does. So this is soft focus. There is also glow, which is much more subtle, but again, you're not really dealing with contrast here. And glow, to be honest, is probably a fair name for it. Autumn effect, many of you will have heard of or played around with the autumn effect. Basically, it's taking a blurred layer and a sharp layer and blending them together. And again, all of these look pretty horrible when the amount is 100. And then there's autumn effect soft, which, as you'd expect, is just a softer version. So glow can be pretty nice, but it doesn't play around with the contrast in the way that I love that the mystical tool does. So if I add some mystical, 44 there, so pretty strong, but if I turn it off, and if you just watch the claw over on the left bit of the image, you can see that the darks go darker and the lights go lighter. And the edges go softer. And of course, when you're editing in any software, there are a million ways to achieve that. But having it available in one slider is something that I love. And then the last tool that I was going to talk about is matte, which basically flattens out a lot of the colours and the tones. So it can give photos quite a vintage look. If I take this all the way to 100, you get what looks like and I hesitate to say this, but like a filmic image. And you can even add fade on top of that. And again, that looks way too far. But I find that between these three tools, I get so much more control than I do just with a glass filter in front of my lens. This one works nicely. This is off, and this is on. Off, on. This is an example of a photo where there's a bit less difference, seemingly, between all the tools, and therefore a mixture of the tools tends to work quite well. So if I add some mystical, let's go for 40. So this is on, this is off, on, off. And if you look at this C defense, if I turn it on and off, on and off, you can see that it's just adding contrast, but in a really beautiful way. So that's a pretty nice place to start. Then if I go to glow, and if I go to autumn effect, let's add an amount that's way too strong, and then just dial it back to something like 9. Off, on, off, on. You can see it's a similar effect, but all the tones in glow are treated a bit more evenly. Then let's go to matte, and let's add way too much matte, something like that. And again, let's just dial it back and add in some fade. Off, on, off, on. Then that just adds a really nice bit of texture to the shot, I find. Anyway, in answer to the question that I'm asked a lot, no, I don't use mist filters. I do this instead. And if you're interested in using this tool, I'll leave a link in the description, plus a discount code to get the best deal possible. And yeah, big thank you to Skylum for sponsoring this video. Really appreciate it. See you next time. Cheers. Oh, this is funny actually. At the end of the last video, I was mentioning, was it the end of the last video or middle of the last video? Doesn't matter. I had some comments on the last video about my desk and whether or not I'd hacked it apart or in half basically to get my printer in my office. That's not entirely accurate. My dad did it. I've got an embarrassingly small number of tools considering I'm a fully grown adult, so I still have to get my dad to come around and do stuff like that for me. So he brought his jigsaw or his circular saw, whatever it was, cut up my desk, and I think, in fact I know, that he'd have loved to have turned it into a neat job, but as soon as he'd done that, I was like, perfect, fine, printer fits now, great, let's move on. So sorry Dad, because I did have comments saying, oh, that looks a bit rough, and that probably winds my dad up. But yeah, there we go. I need to find some WD-40 as well for my chair, as you can probably hear. Anyway, see you next time. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it.